Good morning, everyone. We're so excited here this morning. I have Billy McNeely Johnston with us, and she's going to talk to us about financial elder abuse. So this is a big thing that happens in our industry related to home and home ownership. So we're really fortunate to have Billy here with us. Before I turn it over, I'll give a quick intro on Billy, and also if you have any questions that come up during the webinar, just feel free to send them in using your question box on the GoToWebinar panel. Okay, Billy is the State Financial Exploitation Specialist for Aging and People with Disabilities. She was a police officer for over 6 years with the cities of Scappoose, Tigard, and Hillsborough. She then moved on to work as a fraud investigator with the State of Oregon Employment Department and was recognized in the last year of service for finding over $1 million of unemployment benefits paid out due to fraudulent claims. Wow. Billy is also a certified instructor at DPSST and teaches the Elder Abuse Investigations class at the Police Academy. She sits on a variety of task forces and elder abuse committees and presents on elder financial abuse to bankers, credit unions, security task forces, CPAs, law enforcement, and district attorneys. She currently resides in Salem with her husband and daughter and their 2 dogs. So Billy, go ahead and take it away.
Perfect. Thank you so much for having me here today. So today we're going to be talking about elder financial abuse. Okay, and so my point today is to give you kind of a snapshot on what is happening here in Oregon. And what's happening in Oregon, we can pretty much translate nationally. Oregon follows the trends as far as the U.S. and elder financial abuse. So I want to give you a story as to our why. This is Eva. Eva was a widow. Her husband was a plumber. Eva and her husband had no kids. Eva really didn't have any family. She lived alone. Her husband had done very well in life, and he had pretty much set her up. The house was paid for. She was set up for the rest of her life. But as we see in our elder financial victims, loneliness plays a big part in financial exploitation of the elderly. So Eva's really only companionship was her prized garden that she had, specifically her roses that she would enter in the state fair every year. So you could oftentimes see Eva out in her garden tending to her roses. So this is how the perpetrator found Eva. She was walking her dog and struck up a conversation with Eva about her roses. So Eva was very lonely and hungry for the conversation, so she's more than happy to talk to this person about her roses. So the lady came back the next day and talked to Eva some more. At that time, she asked Eva if she could come back and help Eva in her garden, which she did. So that went on for a couple of weeks. Flash forward about a month, this perpetrator is now kind of infiltrated Eva's life. She is taking her to the doctors to get her medications refilled, to the grocery store. She's helping her with things around the house, such as laundry and cooking. So she's kind of taken on that caregiving role. So let's move forward a little bit more. And what else do we find that the perpetrator has now taken over? Eva's finances. So at this point, it's been probably 5 or 6 months. And this perpetrator has basically taken on the role of the daughter that Eva never had in her life. That's how predatory this person was. So she convinces Eva, who was legally blind and had a little bit of a palsy, and as we age, our ability to manage our finances decline. So Eva was more than happy to kind of relinquish all of her personal information, all of her account information to this perpetrator, so this person could manage her finances. Well, this perpetrator literally systematically siphoned everything from Eva's accounts. When Adult Protective Services came to Eva with law enforcement, the perpetrator had left about 37 cents in Eva's accounts, And kind of the way that she was able to do this, because Eva had given her all of her personal information as soon as the perpetrator had this, she called the banks and she called the investment companies and she purported herself to be Eva and basically said, this is Eva, this is all of my information, please change my address to X, which ended up being the perpetrator's address. And please change my telephone number to Y, which was the perpetrator's telephone number. So when the concerned banks and investment corporations did call and did send notices, they were actually sending it to the perpetrator's house. So when law enforcement and adult protective services came to confront Eva and the perpetrator, they had separated them. And in this case, it's so difficult for an elderly person to wrap their brain around this type of betrayal. She did not want to believe that this person that had become her daughter, in a sense, would do this to her. Even showing all of the bank financial documents, she did not want to believe that this person would betray her like that. And it literally took her listening to law enforcement questioning the perpetrator in the other room, and the perpetrator covering her head and sliding down the side of the refrigerator, crying and saying, Eva, I did it. I'm so sorry. I did it. For Eva to begin to even try to wrap her brain around what happened, she had absolutely no idea. She lost her house. She lost all of her belongings. And she ended up in an adult foster home because she really didn't have the funds to pay for like a nice nursing facility. She died about 6 months later. And in these types of cases, financial exploitation, especially to the extent of something like this, it's so much more than money. It's a loss, and it's a loss. It's a personal loss. It's a loss of a friendship. It's a loss of a loved one. It's a very big emotional loss. So that's kind of our why. It's a complicated problem. In Oregon here, the baby boomers are really taking over. So that 65 and older population has really entered the scene. And people are living longer. The CDC put out a report that puts Oregon in the top quarter of the United States as far as longevity. So if you retire at the age of 65 years old, your average life expectancy is about 19.3 years. So we're having to save money for a longer period of time. Whereas back in the 50s and 60s, people were only saving for, 5 to 10 years because that was the life expectancy back then. Our ability to manage our finances declines as we age. That is just a fact. Some people, it happens at a faster rate, and some people definitely at a slower decline. But statistics say it is happening. And in the last 5 years, there's been a 27 increase on the reports that we get for financial exploitation of our seniors. Another fact is about 75% of our nation's wealth is owned by today's seniors. So we're putting a really large target on their back. They own all the wealth, and now they are this huge population in Oregon and throughout the United States. So for Oregon, we see our projected growth of our senior population is a very staggering number. Between the years of 2012 and 2030, our estimated senior population will rise 175%. And that is a really big number. And that's why we're seeing such staggering numbers in our financial exploitation cases as they're rising. It's also estimated that at the year of 2030, there will be more people aged 65 and older than there will be children 18 years or younger. So for us, what is financial exploitation? And I'm not going to completely bore you guys with the administrative rules on this, but when we are looking at and when we are investigating financial exploitation or financial elder abuse, what we are looking at was something taken wrongfully, and was there some other element to the wrongful taking? Were they tricked into it? Was there deceit? Were they under duress? Was there some type of a fraud? Now, undue influence is really interesting because it's not really statutorily defined here in Oregon, and it can mean a whole lot of things. Undue influence could be someone asking an elder to sign over their house in a threatening means, saying, if you don't go through with this, you know, we're going to put you in a home, you're going to be out on the street, even though they may not have the power to be able to do that. There's some sort of threat or harassment attached to that. But undue influence can also mean the opposite of that. It could be, we see a lot in the sweetheart scam. So maybe someone has integrated themselves into an elderly person's life and they're significantly younger, and that elderly person has a lot of wealth and assets, and you can just tell that they're, you know, the elderly person now may be changing wills and beneficiaries on accounts, and you can tell that there is, you know, that person's kind of a ne'er-do-well and they don't have the best interest of that elderly person. Also medications, when we look at financial elder abuse, and the medications, most of the time what we're looking at, because most of the time what they're being taken are the opioids, which is also a big topic in both Oregon and across America. So also by alarming an adult, by conveying a threat to take property, if that adult reasonably believes that that threat would be carried out. So again, threatening somebody. Misappropriating or misusing funds from an account held jointly or singly. This gets really sticky. I think I do a lot of training with bankers and law enforcement, and that account held jointly really kind of throws a lot of people. So when we look at those cases, what we're really looking at is we take that account, if we can get the bank financials, and we kind of pull it apart and say, okay, so the elderly person, you know, maybe they have PERS coming in and maybe another, you know, investment coming in and Social Security, and maybe they have, you know, a daughter on that account who might be unemployed or have very limited resources. And you can tell that the money that is coming out, it isn't matching up what the elder's pattern of spending in the past is. So that's kind of what we have to look at there. And then failing to use the income or assets for their benefit or support. Unfortunately, what we see these in is son or daughter decide that elderly parent is kind of a nuisance or a burden to them, and they don't want to take care of them, so they place them in a facility. Maybe they have power of attorney over their bank accounts, and so, you know, 3 months later, the elderly person gets a notice that they're going to be kicked out of the nursing facility because their bill is not being paid. So the person that's on that joint account, son or daughter, is not paying for their support to be there. Instead, you can see the money going out to Disneyland trips and to excessive Amazon Prime and to whatever else that person is choosing to spend that elderly person's money on. Okay, so when we look at, we look at different types of abuse for adult protective services. Financial elder abuse every year is our highest abuse type that we investigate. Predominantly females are the victims, although if we look at males, even though they're predominantly females, if we look at all of the abuse types, males still, that financial category still is the highest abuse type for a male elderly victim. So who are the bad guys? Unfortunately, the perpetrators in these cases are the ones closest to them. It is the family members. So we're looking at the daughters and the sons and the granddaughters and the grandsons. And then after that, we're looking at a caregiver. So it's these people in these close, trusted relationships that are the ones that are actually perpetrating the elder abuse. Now, we do see acquaintances at about 22%, so those might be friends or neighbors. But if you look in the top, only 3.4% constitutes a professional con artist, and we'll talk about scams a little bit later, and that's in that other category. But we hear that a lot. We see that a lot in social media and a lot, on the Oregonian. But professional scams, although they do take a lot of money from our elders, statistically, they're a lower percentage of perpetrators. So why do the bad guys do this? So occasion and opportunity, a lot of times it's family members that don't necessarily start out with ill intent. Maybe they become power of attorney, or they get placed on an account, and then they're in kind of a hard situation, so they're like, oh, I'm gonna borrow $500, and then they don't pay it back. Or in their head, they kind of get, we call it the entitlement complex. So they start to think, well, it's my inheritance anyways, it's my money, when in fact it's not. It is still the elderly person's money until they are deceased. Desperation, these are the people, we see this a lot in addiction, so whether it's drugs or alcohol or some sort of gambling addiction, they get desperate for money and they have access to those accounts. And then predation, these are just merely the bad guys and the predators. Like I had narrated in Eva's story, that particular perpetrator had a previous criminal history for doing this to other elderly people. So they specifically target and prey on the vulnerabilities of these elderly people. So what's taken? Money. There's a lot of money taken. We can see real estate in the top kind of left-hand corner. That's at 3%. When we see real estate, again, a lot of times this is family members, and it gets really sticky because we start to have to look at the cognition of the elderly person. Were they able to understand the transaction that was taking place when they sold the home for $100 or $1,000 or $1 to son or daughter or friend? Debit and credit, again, we see scams at 3%. Jewelry, identity, we see medications again. Majority is money that we see somehow siphoned out of the elderly person's accounts. So why does this matter? So average, if we're looking at the retirement savings across the United States, our average retirement savings at 50 is about $108,000. For a victim that loses in a scam or a fraud or a financial exploitation case, the US victim average loses $120,000. So you can see that the math doesn't quite work out there. A lot of money. Now in Oregon, and the Oregon, we're not looking at retirement savings, but at the average Oregon victim of financial exploitation is going to lose about $25,000. That number is a bit dated, so I would argue that it's higher. And also with the caveat that only 1 in 44 cases of financial exploitation ever gets referred to Adult Protective Services or law enforcement. So there's a lot that goes on out there that we don't know about. And why? So why don't we know about it? So the elderly person may just be afraid to talk about what happened. And they may be afraid because they don't want to lose their independence. They're afraid that if they, tell son or daughter that they fell victim to a fraud or scam, that the elder or the daughter or the son will start talking about maybe placing the person into a facility. And what we see statistically in our elderly population is that they really want to live out those golden years in their own home. So they may be afraid. They may be afraid of the perpetrator. We see a lot of co-occurring abuse, and I'll talk about the other abuse types just very briefly at the end on what is investigated for elder abuse. But a lot of times we see co-occurring abuse that happens. So there may be physical abuse, or there may be neglect that's happening along with that financial exploitation. So they may be afraid to tell law enforcement or adult protective services or talk to anyone about what's actually happening. And then they might not understand what's going on. Kind of in the case that I narrated about Eva, she really had no clue because she had just relinquished all of those finances over to that perpetrator. She had no idea what had happened until it was too late. They may not be able to verbalize what happened. And those are the cases, you know, maybe they have a stroke or they have advanced Alzheimer's or they're in dementia or there's a cognitive decline that causes that lack of verbalization. So they may not be able to communicate or communicate effectively. So when we go out and when I teach law enforcement to go out and talk to these victims, we really try to have them take their time with these elderly people, because even though they have dementia or they have Alzheimer's, and you know the perpetrator or the family member might be saying no, they're crazy, or they don't understand what's going on, or they don't remember, it doesn't mean that the elderly person doesn't have something valid to say. They may be ashamed that a family member is mistreating them. We see this so much, as does law enforcement. And it's really difficult when you see a family member stealing so much money from the elderly person. And even in the cases where perhaps the elderly person may be living in a facility or an apartment and they're only on Social Security, and maybe they're only getting $700 or $800 a month, taking $50 from someone that's income is $600 or $700 can mean if they're going to eat the last week of that month. So it can be very, very devastating. And then they don't think that police or social service agencies can help. You know, they may be old school and they may not be up on the know that elder abuse is a thing that society is really standing up and paying attention to. They don't think that police could help, or they may not even know who Adult Protective Services are and that there's an agency out there that literally can provide protective services so that they can stop this exploitation or abuse. Okay, I wanted to touch on power of attorney abuse because I think that that's a lot of what may overlap into what perhaps you might see. Power of attorneys can be used for good, but every time I hear power of attorney when I'm staffing a case, or when someone comes up to tell me their story and it contains power of attorney, I cringe, because in my head it's become this license to steal, and that is not the intent. So statutorily, literally, the power of attorney says that unless otherwise provided in the power of attorney document, the agent must use that for the property of the principal for the benefit of the principal. So basically, if you become power of attorney for someone, all of that money and funds that you now have control over, you have to use that. Like statutorily, it says you must use that for the benefit of the elderly person. That doesn't just give you access of the funds or the property or the assets for your own self. So looking at, in power of attorney abuse, what our biggest hurdles are for adult protective services, it's evidence. And the reason that is for evidentiary reasons, and what mostly they're referring to is bank documents. And in Oregon, sometimes banks can be incredibly helpful, and sometimes they can be incredibly prohibitive. Statutorily, if they are the complainant on a financial elder abuse case, they're allowed to provide us supporting documents that say, hey, this financial exploitation is occurring, and here are the documents that support what we think that we see. Not all of the banks will do this. Depending, the credit unions are really good. Some of the smaller banks are really good. Some of the larger banks get really difficult to work with, and they want a subpoena. But in Oregon, Adult Protective Services does not have administrative subpoena powers, so they have to work with law enforcement or the district attorney's office to get that subpoena. And if Adult Protective Services doesn't have enough evidence they won't be able to get law enforcement or the district attorneys to bite off on that case. So it kind of becomes this like never-ending wheel of frustration. For law enforcement and for the district attorney's office, it's dementia, it's that cognitive decline, and like I said earlier, you know, when you're interviewing and when you're talking to these people that have that cognitive decline, it does not mean that they can't narrate for themselves or they can't advocate for themselves. Sometimes you just have to take a little bit longer. In some cases, it does that you're not going to be able to get anything out of them. And for the DA's office, it becomes this, you know, should we put them on the stand and let the jury see exactly how declined they are so that the jury can see, you know, when that perpetrator had them sign over the house or sign over the bank accounts. There was no way that that elderly person would be able to understand what they were signing, or not to put them on the stand because they don't want the jury to see how declined they are. It kind of depends on the county and the DA's office on what their preference is on that. So financial victimization, and this slide comes directly from the police academy, and what basically we are trying to say and what we try to teach is that even if the elderly person participates in their own victimization, it still can be criminal. So for instance, if they sign a power of attorney under duress, you know, if someone says, sign this power of attorney, or else you won't be able to see your grandkids, or else I'm going to lock you in the basement, or else I'm not going to take you to bingo or church, or, you know, whatever other threat that's entailed, and that person signs that power of attorney, they're participating in their own victimization, but they're doing so under duress. Same with, we see a lot, elderly people still like to write checks. They just do, and they like to go into the banks. They just like that contact. So we'll see a caregiver, or we will see someone that has, you know, taken over the elderly person's finances. They'll have them sign a bunch of checks. Just sign all of these checks, and I'll go ahead and take care of, you know, the bills. Well, the elderly person signing those checks to pay for their insurance and to pay for their gas bill, not for the perpetrator to make it out to themselves and go to the bank for cash. Same with an ATM card. If the elderly person gives that perpetrator an ATM card and gives them their PIN number and says, here, go get me a gallon of milk and a newspaper, and yet the perpetrator comes back with a flat screen television, they're participating in their own victimization in the sense that they gave them all of that personal information, but they didn't give them permission to buy that $700 flat screen TV. They wanted milk and a newspaper. I wanted to talk a little bit about House Bill 2622, and this was implemented October 1st, 2017 under an emergency passing through the legislature. And we're still trying to get the word out there with banks, and with law enforcement and adult protective services, but this is a really good tool in the toolbox, and I think that it's good for you guys to know that this is something that is able to be done in case if we act quick enough. So it authorizes financial institutions to refuse certain transactions when they reasonably believe that exploitation of a vulnerable person either may have occurred, is occurring, or might occur. And what it allows them to do, it gives them so many tools in their toolbox, and it also covers them, it protects them from liability on this if they're acting in good faith. So it gives the financial institutions the ability to refuse a transaction with or involving that vulnerable person, to refuse to permit the withdrawal of disbursement of funds in the account, to prevent a change in ownership, to prevent a transfer of funds from that vulnerable person's account to an account held wholly or partially by another, and to refuse to comply with instructions given to the institution by the power of attorney signed or purported to have been signed by that vulnerable person. So a lot of tools in the toolbox to be able to prevent that financial exploitation from occurring. We're looking at about 15 days from when the financial institution first acted. So the financial institution can do this on their own, or they can do this if Adult Protective Services or law enforcement or the DA's office calls and says, hey, this transaction's coming down, it's not authorized, the person didn't have capacity to understand what they were signing, please put a hold on this. It also is permissive, meaning the banks may do it, it's not a must. So it kind of depends on their knowledge of the House bill, as well as their legal counsel, pretty much. They can also stop when the financial institution is satisfied that the vulnerable person will not be further exploited, or if a court just says, no, sorry, this transaction actually was lawful, here's a court order that says to unfreeze that account. So 15 days seems kind of like a long time, but in the court system and with law enforcement and investigation processes with these complicated financial cases, 15 days is not a long time. So they also wrote into the House bill, if the financial institution believes they can extend the duration based on a reasonable belief that that financial exploitation of that vulnerable person is still going to continue or might be attempted. All right, so I talked a little bit about scams. They're costing seniors a whole lot. As we can see, $36.5 billion, and this is a national figure. So these are the IRS scams, these are the sweetheart scams, these are the grand jury scams, the grandparent scams, the utility scams. Anything that you can think of, the scammers have thought of how to scam it. Recently, the most recent scam is because the Social Security Administration issued, so Medicare cards used to have our Social Security numbers on it. That was the identifying Medicare number. So they decided that wasn't a good idea. So now in waves, they are now reissuing Medicare cards to everybody that's on Medicare with a different identifying number. Well, now the scammers know that this is happening, so they are calling and purporting themselves to be the Social Security Administration, saying, hey, this is the Social Security. Before we make that transition over from your old Social Security card to your new Medicare card, we need to go ahead and verify some of your personal information to make sure that this is who you really are. And a lot of people just truly are falling for it. And then they say, oh, well, just, you probably didn't know, but there's a $500 fee that we need to go ahead and take at this time to go ahead and make that transaction, when the Social Security Administration will never call and say that. The same as the IRS will never call you and tell you that you owe them $10,000 and to pay them in iTunes gift cards. And I talked about these grandparent scam. This is one that we see where, you know, someone will call and it'll kind of be muffled and say, you know, grandma, it's me. And then, you know, the grandma will say, oh, is that you, Tommy? Oh, yes, it's me, Tommy. You know, and grandma might say, well, you don't sound like yourself. Oh, because I got in a car accident, a DUI in Mexico, and now I'm in a Mexican prison and they're going to hold me here forever. Please send money, but don't tell mom, but I need it right away. And then that elderly person kind of gets wrapped up in that, you know, grandparent love where they want to help. And we call it the ether thinking, where they just kind of get put into this panic of wanting to help, and they just, their rational thought process starts to diminish when we're in that ether thinking. Lottery scam is still alive and well. Sweetheart scams are super devastating. We had a case in Marion County, and just when I think that I can't actually hear anything more outlandish in some of these cases, I do. And the case we had in Marion County, the elderly gentleman had been befriended by someone on Facebook who he started an online romance with, and this person had, she lived in the UK, and she was in imports exports allegedly, and she had told him that she had 2 trunks of pirate's booty that she needed to make its way over to the United States because it was worth so much more in the US than it would be there. She even had someone call and purport to be her barrister, saying how legit this whole thing was. By this time, you know, he had fancied himself completely in love with her. Her promise was to get these trunks of pirate's booty over to the US and to set up this beautiful life for them, and they would be married. And he, in the period of 1 week, sent 2 $40,000 wires across sea to try to facilitate the taxes payment on these trunks of pirate's booty to be able to get them over. And again, when Adult Protective Services went out, he literally couldn't wrap his brain around that this person was probably a dude, you know, in Canada or Florida or Jamaica, and had, you know, was not his sweetheart that he had fancied himself in love with. These are especially devastating because they particularly prey on the lonely and the recently widowed. So it's, again, goes back to that predatory inheritance scam. Those are a little bit on the decline. I think all of us have received calls about, you know, our computer has a virus. Is it running slowly? What's your IP address? Give me your account information. The bank examiner scam, you know, sometimes there'll be scams that say, hey, this is your bank calling, and they'll even, the scammers are smart enough to make it look like they're calling from certain banks, or they look like they're calling from an Oregon area code, or it looks like they're calling from Marion County Sheriff's Office. They're very, very savvy with this. So it may look like your bank is calling, and they'll say, you know, your account has been compromised. Someone called and like purported that they were you, so I need to go ahead and verify some information from you to make sure that this is actually you. And, you know, again, it puts you in that state of like ether thinking where you're like, oh my gosh, my money, I need to protect it. And you're not thinking like, oh, wait a minute, this might actually be not my bank calling, and I'm giving all of this personal information over to someone, again, in Canada or wherever they may be calling from. Telemarketing, medical equipment, and then we talked about the Social Security Medicare scam. The Attorney General's office has they're called scam jams, and the next one that I participate in them. It's the Attorney General's office from the DOJ, and then myself, normally local law enforcement, and then the FTC and the Construction Contractors Board, and a lot of agencies come out to give presentations to elderly people in the community on how to protect themselves from these scams. And they do about 5 or 6 a year, and they kind of spread it out all over Oregon. The next one is in Medford, and it's in a couple of weeks. But the Attorney General's office, if you go to their consumer protection website, has a plethora of information. You can order free materials, and they have a very brief flyer that we hand out to everybody. Scammers, 6 sides it's a scam. If scammers contact you out of the blue, again, if they claim there's some sort of an emergency, if they're asking for personal information, if they want you to wire money, it's so important to get that out. If they wire money, and especially if it's overseas, it's really nearly impossible to get that money back. Same with those prepaid Visa or Green Dot cards, that the scammers are so aggressive that they will literally, we had a scammer down south who, this poor woman, they had literally called her every day, all day. She had given him $300,000 via these wiring money and the Green Dot and the other gift cards. They would stay with her on the telephone. They would call her on her cell phone, stay with her on her telephone as she drove to the Walmart, bought the gift cards, and then crossed off the numbers or scratched off the numbers in the back and read them the numbers, and then the money was gone. And $300,000 later, we were finally able to get her to change her telephone number. And these bad guys, because of all the information that's available on that, that dark web, they had her new telephone number within 5 days. And we tell people, if you don't know who's calling, don't answer the phone. And so she wasn't answering the telephone, and they started to send taxi cab drivers to her house to check on her, saying, oh, your friends are checking on you. They sent her pizza to her house because she's, you can change your telephone number, but you can't really change your address. And then the poor woman, she came home from yoga class to find her house surrounded literally by a SWAT team because the bad guys had called in that she was being held captive in her bathroom. So the woman was literally so scared. These scammers get really, really, really aggressive. Scammers tell you to keep it a secret. And we tell people, if you remember nothing, remember the last one. If it sounds too good to be true, it is. Okay, just for you guys, recognizing some signs of financial elder abuse. If the elder is accompanied by someone that kind of looks a little shady, or they may not have the elder person's best interest, we all have gut instincts. We all have hunches. When we meet people, or even in the grocery store, we get feelings. Listen to those feelings and those intuitions, and ask questions if you think something's up. If someone is speaking on behalf of the elderly person, why is that? Are they speaking on behalf because the elderly person is scared to talk around them? Are they speaking on behalf of the elderly person because the elderly person is so far cognitively declined that they're not able to speak for themselves or understand any transactions going on around them? The elderly person may have limited independence, so they may live rurally and they may not be able to get out to places, and they may be dependent upon that caregiver or that family member that is exploiting them for things. And they may show just outright fearful behaviors. If the elderly person is confused and cannot give plausible explanations for finances, so if they can't remember signing a document, we see this a lot. They don't remember signing a power of attorney, or they don't remember signing over that house, or they don't remember putting that person on that joint account. Or we look at their finances and go over it with them and say, okay, well, what about this $500 ATM withdrawal? And they live in St. John's, and the withdrawal is in, Medford. Then it's like, well, how did that happen? If the elderly person appears neglected or is in danger of losing housing, why is that? And if there's a sense of urgency and or secrecy, and that kind of goes hand in hand with one of those 6 signs it's a scam. Suspicious financial activities. So are there large and frequent withdrawals? We look at those. We are all creatures of habit in our lives. I shop at the same grocery stores for the most part because they're close to home, go to the same gas stations because they're close to home or they're next to work. I buy a lot of Amazon Prime. Like, you can go through my bank documents and see kind of who I am. But so when we go back and we pull bank records, if we can get them, we really look at, so the time of the suspected financial fraud of that elderly person, we look back. And we look back to see what's normal for them before this elder abuse occurred in their life. So we could go back and look. That way, when we look forward, we can see what is unusual, what is not a habit for that person. Frequent changes in accounts, new or changing power of attorneys. Again, if the elderly person cannot understand the documents that they are signing, whether it's a will or a trust or a power of attorney, that is not a valid document. Other people's handwriting on checks. So you guys may not necessarily see this. We always, when we look at bank accounts, we look we get canceled checks, and we look back and we see, what's the handwriting like? And although we're not handwriting, we don't work for the state police, we're not handwriting exemplar specialists, you can definitely see what is absolutely not that person's handwriting. And request to wire money internationally, I would just say request to wire money, especially if that's not usual for that elderly person. A sudden increase in debt, as in the case of Eva, mail is no longer being mailed to the customer's home. Why is that? Is it because the perpetrator has changed that address and that telephone number to have all of that information sent to them? That way the elderly person's kind of kept into the dark, so they have no idea what's going on about their financial matters. Second, mortgages, large or frequent online banking transfers to accounts accessible by other parties. So who's at risk? Well, everybody is at risk, and just because they're 65 or older doesn't mean that they're vulnerable. That's just how Oregon has adapted our elder abuse statutes. So in some states it's 60 and older, but Oregon chose 65 and older. But what we're looking at, adults who are frail or ill, disabled, depressed, and lonely, and we see these so many times when one partner has passed away, and that leaves, mom or dad alone, and they may be lonely and looking for company. And if you're not checking in on them, they may really become vulnerable for, predators or scammers. Adults who are physically or emotionally dependent on others. Adults who have cognitive impairment. So again, that cognitive decline as we enter our golden years. And then again, for people that may have recently been widowed, they may, it might be that the man had managed their finances for their entire lives. And now that he's passed away, the wife that's left there has no idea what he's done in the past or how to even be able to go about moving forward with those finances. So professional roles in assessing capacity. So when you're talking to the elderly people, the client's ability to articulate the reasoning behind that decision, are they able to say, yes, I want this to happen and this is why? The variability of the client's state of mind. In Alzheimer's and advanced dementia, there are what are kind of referred to as moments of clarity. And so there may be, for those of us that have had people in our lives that have experienced Alzheimer's or dementia, there are those moments of clarity where they will recognize you or they will be able to recall things. So for, let's say, making a will, that is kind of the lowest, it's called testamentary capacity. That's kind of the lowest form of capacity that's needed to execute a document. So if an attorney is executing a will and is able to talk to that person and they are in moments of clarity and able to articulate, yes, this is what I want and this is why I want this, that will may still be valid. The client's ability to understand the consequences of their decisions. Does that person know if they sell their house for $100 that they're not going to have any place to live, nor are they going to have that money and equity that they have it's probably paid off? So do they understand the consequences for those actions or the irreversibility of those decisions? The substantive fairness of transactions, again, selling a car for $10, selling a house for $1,000, that's, on $100,000 over in Eastern Oregon, what is the substantive fairness of the transaction, and do they actually understand that? The consistency of the actor transactions with the client's lifetime commitment. So that goes back to that. We are creatures of habits. Have they always said, I want the house to go to Bobby? Or is this all of a sudden new because, you know, Bobby's been in prison down in California for 50 years, but now he's out and he's moved in and is quote unquote taking care of mom. But yet, you know, mom traditionally has said the house is going to go to Sally. So for contracts, the test of mental capacity requires the person shall have the ability to understand the nature and affect the act in which he is engaged and the business which he is transactioning. And that is super old school. That's from an appellate case back in 1975, but still stands true to today. So again, that person that is executing that contract or that deed has to have the ability to understand what is happening. So if you make a call to Adult Protective Services, let's say you are fully on board and you're like, this is absolutely financial elder abuse and I'm going to make the choice to go ahead and report it to Adult Protective Services. So Adult Protective Services, or APS, we do civil investigations, not criminal. And then we also provide protective services to that person, and that could kind of be a multitude of things. Could be an elder abuse restraining order, could be money management, could be a bunch of different things to make that elderly person safe. I kind of talk back in the past, some elderly people are not cooperative because they don't want that family member to get in trouble, so they can absolutely refuse to participate in the investigation, which can be very frustrating. If you call in and make a report to Adult Protective Services, all of your information is confidential. The only way that you and your information would be released is, let's say it went to a criminal trial and the judge calls you as a witness and says, you know, this person was a witness to this transaction. Otherwise, Adult Protective Services and law enforcement's not going to go out and say, hey, Mrs. Smith, you know, this realtor called and said that she had concerns about this transaction, that you're trying to transact the house over to the son. So when you make the report, it goes through a screening process. So we look, is the person 65 and older? We look at all the different abuse types for elder financial, or elder abuse that we investigate. Does it fit into that category? Can we offer them any services? And then if at any time we think that a crime's been committed, we are mandatorily obligated to make that referral over to law enforcement so that they can investigate that crime. And it's the same with law enforcement. If they go to a scene and they think that abuse is occurring, they have to make that cross report over to Adult Protective Services so that they can get involved. If there's Medicaid funds involved, we might make a Medicaid referral to the fraud unit, or Social Security funds, we might make a referral to their fraud unit. The Department of Justice, we make a lot of referrals because they handle all the scams. So we will make a lot of those scam referrals over to the Department of Justice to let them take care of that. So beyond financial exploitation, I talked about the other areas of abuse that we look at. Neglect, and for neglect, the person that's taking care of the elderly person has to have a legal or assumed duty to care for that elderly person. So legal being either a contract, so it might be a nursing facility, or a in-home paid caregiver. It also could be a fiduciary legal duty, so maybe they are a conservator or power of attorney. So if there's some sort of legal binding. An assumed duty to care is when you move mom into the house because she's, you know you can still take care of her, but you do her laundry and you cook her meals and you make sure and get her to her doctor's appointments and fill her prescriptions. So that is that assumed duty to care. And neglect could be not giving medications, not giving food. It could be a lot of things. It's kind of a broad category, but normally that elderly person is in some sort of decline because the person that's supposed to be taking care of them are not. Physical abuse, we follow a lot of the assault statutes for that. So bruising, scratches, bite marks, could be pinching. A lot of times they'll do it on places that aren't visible. So, they may wear sweaters to cover up the bruising, and it could be, a very warm day. Sexual abuse, we see this particular form of abuse has a higher percentage of occurring in facilities, but we do see sexual abuse happening in the community, unfortunately. Abandonment, there was a very famous Oregon case probably about 15 years ago where an Oregon woman had driven her father all the way to Idaho and left him at a racetrack. He was in a wheelchair, he was nonverbal, he wasn't able to talk, and she had pinned care instructions to his sweater with a wrong name, and then kind of like, I've got diabetes, and the rest of the care instructions for his medical issues, and then drove all the way back home by herself and continued to cash his Social Security and pension checks while Idaho was trying to figure out who this elderly person was. And that was eventually, she was convicted and went to jail for that. Involuntary seclusion, in those cases, what we look at are, again, that co-occurring abuse. Are they keeping that person from talking to other family members, from talking to, church members or lawyers or doctors, because normally there's some other kind of abuse that's occurring that they don't want to have known. And then the last one there was wrongful restraint, and that could be a physical restraint or it could be a chemical restraint where they're over medicating on purpose. So that they basically don't have to deal with that person. And then if you want to report, this is called the Safe Line. It is the Oregon hotline for reporting. It's reporting all abuse, whether it's child abuse, elder abuse, abuse of those with a developmental disability. So 1-855-503-SAFE. And it's literally kind of like a really, really well done phone tree where you call it, it'll say press 1 for child abuse, press 2 for adult abuse, and then it'll ask you for the zip code of the elderly person. And if you have that zip code, and punch it in, it'll take you directly to that local office that will have a live person that would be doing that investigation. If you don't know the zip code, you can press 0, and it'll also take you a live person Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, who can get that information to that local office. Or there is a web address at the bottom if you want to look up a specific county local branch. And then this is me and my information. If you have follow-up questions, or if you run into something and have concerns and do I report it? Do I not report it? Does this sound right? Feel free to reach out to me. It's literally my job for community outreach and education and consulting and teaching about this. So don't feel bad about reaching out and asking even what you think might be a silly question.
Wow, Billy, thank you so much for all of the information. It was just a bunch of information, and I think realtors around the state will be able to use this, to spot elder abuse and contact and call in. So that's great. Just a reminder to everyone, send your sign-in sheets to the info@oregonrealtors.org email addresses, and this webinar will be available for viewing online on our course catalog in about a week. Thank you.